Welcome to Help Me Understand My Bible. And in our last video on Romans chapter 1, we saw how the Apostle Paul wrapped up the whole family of humanity in the guilty, sinful condition. Because Romans chapter 1 wraps up with the bad news. The bad news is that we are all in sin. And we now switch over to Romans chapter 2 to see how he progresses us from there into the good news. Okay, so we will follow as we have here so that we can save time. So Romans chapter 2, we have three sections in Romans chapter 2. Verse 1 to 16, verse 17 to 24, and verse 25 to 29. We'll take them one section at a time. 1 to 16, God's righteous judgment. You therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. For at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself. Because you who pass judgment do the same things. Now, we know that God's judgment against those who do such things is based on truth. So when you, a mere human being, pass judgment on them and yet do the same things, do you think you will escape God's judgment? Or do you show contempt for the riches of his kindness, forbearance, and patience, not realizing that God's kindness is intended to lead you to repentance? But because of your stubbornness and your unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath against yourself for the day of God's wrath, when his righteous judgment will be revealed. God will repay each person according to what they have done. To those who by persistence in doing good seek glory, honor, and immortality, he will give eternal life. But for those who are self-seeking and who reject the truth and follow evil, there will be wrath and anger. There will be trouble and distress for every human being who does evil, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. But glory, honor, and peace for everyone who does good, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. For God does not show favoritism. All who sin apart from the law will perish apart from the law, and all who sin under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves. Even though they do not have the law, they show the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times defending them. This will take place on the day when God judges people's secrets through Jesus Christ, as my gospel declares. So that's the Apostle Paul in the first section on God's righteous judgment. So as a skilled attorney, the Apostle Paul, he's building a case that shows that he is building a case that shows the culpability of the entire family of humanity, both Jews and Gentiles. Paul builds a case as an attorney, and his argument is that man's natural inclination of passing judgment upon his neighbor is self-indicting, because we are guilty of the same faults and so inexcusable before God. So the natural tendency of all humanity, as Paul was speaking to his audience, he says, hey, as human beings, we all think of ourselves as, we tend to think of ourselves as good people, and we judge others, we pass judgment on others, we find fault with others. But Paul says, hey, that is really us incriminating ourselves, because we are also sinners. And we, deep in the human heart, we know that if we say we are not sinners, we are lying. We know we are sinners. And so Paul speaks this way and begins to build his case. So man, being both judge of his fellow man and at the same time a sinner, cannot escape God's righteous judgment. And to continue living in such hypocrisy is a test of God's patience. So we cannot be both judge and sinners at the same time. If we are judge, then we must be perfect. So this was Paul's address to this church, this community, this Jew, Gentile community of believers in Rome. And Paul is addressing them and he's building his case. And he says, you can't be both judge and sinner simultaneously. That's hypocrisy. In fact, that is even more self-incriminating. But man's stubborn and unrepentant heart is only accumulating God's fierce anger and judgment upon themselves. And God will righteously repay everyone as their works deserve on the day of his wrath. So God has a day when he will reveal his righteous anger. This is God will reveal his righteous anger. This is a theme that is built upon right from the Old Testament. And the day that God will reveal his righteous anger on the stubborn and unrepentant heart of mankind, who continue to accumulate anger against God by our hypocrisy, by our collective hypocrisy and sinfulness. So Paul is building his case. And he says, there will be severe punishment for evildoers, whether Jews or Gentiles, and glory, honor, and peace for those who do good, whether Jews or Gentiles, because God does not discriminate. God does not do favoritism. All who sin apart from the law will perish apart from the law. That is Gentiles, those who sin apart from the law, those who do not have the law. Because Paul was addressing, let's remember that he was addressing the members of the Roman church, that those who sin apart from the law will perish apart from the law. That is Gentiles. And all who sin under the law will be judged by the law. That is Jews, because they had the law but they were sinning. The Gentiles did not have the law, but their conscience, their deeds, it was evident that they were sinning, and their conscience accused them. It is not the hearing of the law that justifies, but the perfect obedience to the law. This is what justifies before God. Notice, perfect obedience, which no human being can render. Even without the Old Testament law of Moses, Gentiles are able to discern what is right from what is wrong through their conscience, which either accuses or excuses them. So, even though the Gentiles do not have the law of Moses in the Roman church, but there is a faculty that God has given to all humanity called conscience, and we instinctively know what is right and wrong. And even in ancient times, it worked. So, with or without the holy law of God, all mankind know instinctively what is right and what is wrong, and their conscience will stand as a true witness against them on the day of judgment, on the day when God will judge the secret thoughts of everyone according to the message of the gospel, which Paul calls his gospel, Paul's gospel. So that's the run through on God's righteous judgment. So we now move to the section on verses 17 to 24. The Jews guilty as the Gentiles. So no discrimination there. The Jews are guilty as the Gentiles. Now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and boast in God, if you know his will and approve of what is superior, because you are instructed by the law. If you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of little children, because you have in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth. You then who teach others, do you not teach yourselves? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that people should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? As it is written, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. So Paul points his preaching finger in the faces of the Jews and accuses them and says, basically, okay, so Paul turns his attention to the Jews and highlights their hypocrisy. Despite their boasting, despite their boast and flaunting that they have God's law, they still dishonor God by breaking his holy law. Paul corners them and asks them boldly, have you kept God's law? Have you stolen? Have you committed adultery? Have you looted temples for their idolatrous treasures, in spite of the fact that you feign your hatred for idolatry? That was an interesting thing. As Jews who detested idolatry, there should have been nothing like robbery of temples, but temples were being robbed. It's very interesting that Jews, the people of God, the covenant people, the holy people, and yet stealing was going on in their society. Adultery was going on in their society. So in spite of the fact that they were God's holy people who had the laws, the issue of sin could not be denied. The reality of sin was there even in the Jewish society, the people of God, the so-called people of God. Paul concludes this section by quoting from Ezekiel chapter 32 verse 22, 36 verse 22, and when he says, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you Jews and your hypocrisy. That even the scriptures bear testimony to this, as I had said in Ezekiel 36 verse 22. And because of the issue of sin, sin is the common denominator of all humans, Jews and Gentiles. And Paul was still making inroads with his argument. So we have one section left to go in Romans chapter 2, verses 25 to 29, on asking whether circumcision makes a difference. So Paul wraps up this section, chapter 2. Circumcision has value if you observe the law. But if you break the law, you have become as though you had not been circumcised. So then, if those who are not circumcised keep the law's requirements, will they not be regarded as though they were circumcised? The one who is not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law will condemn you, even though you have the written code and circumcision, if you are a lawbreaker. A person is not a Jew who is one only outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a person's praise is not from other people, but from God. So Paul enters into this section regarding circumcision, and he concludes as follows. Circumcision is of value only when you keep the law, not when you are a lawbreaker. So it's of value when you keep the law, not when you are a lawbreaker. Righteousness will be credited to the uncircumcised man who, although physically uncircumcised, keeps the law. But you Jews are condemned as lawbreakers in spite of the fact that you have the written code and circumcision. You still break your own laws. circumcision is not really a physical mark to boast about. So Paul, in addressing the matter of circumcision, because circumcision is so pivotal and so important to the Jewish race, so Paul has to address this matter of circumcision. And he says that circumcision is not really a physical mark to boast about. Circumcision is about the state of the inner man. It is about the state of the heart. So being a Jew is not necessarily an outward reality in the flesh, but about an inward reality in the spirit. Not about the written code for the praise of men, but about true circumcision of heart, which receives its own praise from God. So, at this point of reading Paul's letter, so this is just like a summary, my own summary of chapter 2 at this point. At this point of reading Paul's letter, nobody is smiling in the room. The Gentiles know that they are guilty as charged according to their conscience. The Jews have seen that their laws, their rituals, their uncircumcision has not shielded them from God's wrath, but rather further exposed their hypocrisy and culpability, even indicting them in a more incriminating way. So this is how the Apostle Paul builds his case, addressing the Roman church, flying at 30,000 feet above ground level. You remember that phrase from chapter 1 when we said that theology, from our introduction rather, that Romans is theology 30,000 feet above ground level. And Paul is uncovering issues, answering questions, delving deeply into the philosophy of religion, the Jewish mindset, breaking through the barriers to bring in the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So we will continue further on that as we enter into Romans chapter 3. Thank you for your time and attention. Please do like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel. See you in the next video. God bless.